Please subscribe to my channel. This is my sincere request to you. I once thought the scariest sound in an accident was grinding steel. I was wrong. The real nightmare was watching my parents study the shattered glass and my drunk brother running away, then calmly choosing me as his sacrificial lamb. In one single night, I lost my career, my dignity, and the apartment I was about to buy. But my family overlooked one deadly little detail about my new vehicle. It did not merely crash. It recorded everything. My name is Reese Wallace. I am 28 years old. And up until the exact second my newly financed crossover met a wall of solid steel, I believed I understood how my world worked. I was a woman built on caution and governed by rigid principles. As a contract coordinator for Marrow and Pike Infrastructure, an engineering firm right here in the heart of Belhaven, North Carolina, my entire life was about mitigating risk. My days were consumed by reading the fine print, double-checking zoning regulations, and ensuring that every single variable in a multi-million-dollar project was accounted for. I was the safety net in the grand theatrical production of the Wallace family. I was the stagehand working in the shadows, making sure the props did not fall apart. I was the reliable child. But in our house, being reliable simply meant you were useful, never that you were a source of pride. Pride was exclusively reserved for my older brother, Dean Wallace. Dean was everything I was not. He was effortlessly handsome, armed with a blinding, predatory smile and a silver tongue that could talk a starving man out of his last meal. He was the undisputed golden boy, the carefully curated public face of the Wallace Crescent project, our family's incredibly lucrative real estate development. Dean did not read contracts. He signed them with a flourish while a photographer captured his good side. He was the heir apparent, meticulously groomed to keep the Wallace name synonymous with wealth and floorless prestige. Tonight was supposed to be a triumphant victory lap for him. We had attended a high society charity fundraiser at the country club, an event dripping in forced laughter, expensive perfumes, and free-flowing bourbon. Dean had spent the better part of 5 hours holding court, soaking up the adulation of local politicians and pouring an alarming amount of aged whiskey down his throat. I watched him from the periphery sipping sparkling water, mentally tracking the hours until I could go home. When the event finally began to empty out past midnight, I walked out into the crisp night air and pulled my brand new crossover up to the valet stand. I had spent the last 2 years saving meticulously for the down payment. It was the first thing I had ever bought entirely on my own without a single cent of Wallace family money. Before I could even wrap my fingers around the door handle, Dean appeared from the shadows. His hand shot out, snatching the key fob right out of my palm. He laughed, a loud, sloppy sound that reeked of top-shelf liquor and absolute unchecked entitlement. He leaned in, his breath hot and sour, and declared that I drove like a terrified grandmother. He said he needed to feel the engine, needed to clear his head before the massive Monday morning board meeting. I argued with him. I reached for the keys, demanding them back, but Dean just shoved his weight against me, bypassing me entirely to slide into the driver's seat. He grinned up at me, that untouchable, arrogant grin, and revved the engine. I was trapped. I had exactly 2 choices. I could scream for the valet and make a humiliating scene in front of the city's elite, or I could get into the passenger seat and pray we made it home in one piece. Against my better judgment, I surrendered. I got in. The moment the doors locked automatically, Dean slammed his foot onto the accelerator. The heavy vehicle tore away from the polished driveway of the country club, its tires screeching in violent protest. We plunged directly into Belhaven's old warehouse district, a desolate stretch of decaying brick buildings and empty loading docks. The street lights bled into a continuous, sickening yellow streak against the glass. I reached up and gripped the plastic handle above the window, my knuckles instantly turning bone white. I begged him to slow down. I told him he was going nearly 70 mph an hour in a 30 mph zone. He completely ignored me. He reached over, cranked the stereo volume to a deafening roar, and started shouting over the heavy bass. He was bragging about the massive zoning deal closing on Monday, boasting about how he had the city council wrapped around his finger. He was invincible, flying high on his own inflated ego and a dangerous blood alcohol level. The intersection of Elm Avenue and 4th Street approached far too quickly. A sharp right turn loomed out of the darkness. Dean jerked the steering wheel hard, but his alcohol-soaked reflexes were fatally delayed. The crossover fisheled violently. The heavy chassis swayed, the tires losing all traction on the damp, cold asphalt. I saw the concrete curb rush up to meet us, then the brick sidewalk, and finally the dark glass-fronted facade of an independent pharmacy that had been closed for hours. 4 thick, bright yellow steel ballards stood firmly planted in the cement to protect the storefront. We did not merely hit them. We were violently consumed by them. The impact was catastrophic. It sounded like a bomb detonating inside the cramped cabin. The front end of the vehicle crumpled inward, screaming as steel folded against steel. The windshield exploded instantly, filling the air with a million glittering jagged diamonds of tempered glass. The force of the sudden stop threw my body violently forward, but the seat belt locked with bone-crushing intensity. I was slammed brutally back against the passenger door panel. A sharp, blinding agony ripped through my right shoulder and tore across my rib cage. The airbags deployed with a concussive blast, punching me squarely in the chest and face. The cabin instantly filled with a suffocating acrid white powder that burned my throat and lungs. A high-pitched, maddening ring pierced my eardrums, completely drowning out the hiss of the dying engine and the steady mocking rhythmic clicking of the hazard lights. For several agonizing seconds, I could not breathe. I tasted hot metallic copper pooling on my tongue. Every desperate attempt to pull air into my lungs felt like rubbing broken glass against my bruised ribs. I blinked hard, trying to clear the powdery haze from my vision, and turned my heavy head slowly to the left. Dean was slumped forward over the deflated canvas of the driver's side airbag, gasping heavily. A thin stream of dark blood trickled down from a nasty gash near his hairline. But as he lifted his head, I could see his eyes. They were wide, frantic, and rapidly sobering. The sheer terror of reality was crashing down on him, hitting him much harder than the steel ballards ever could. He was doing the math in his head. A driving under the influence charge combined with reckless driving and massive property damage would not just shatter his meticulously crafted, clean-cut air persona. It would instantly detonate the Wallace Crescent deal. The investors would pull out, the vital liquor licenses would be permanently revoked, and tens of millions of dollars would vanish overnight. Dean did not reach out to me. He did not ask if I was alive or if my ribs were broken or if I needed an ambulance. Instead, he kicked his jammed door open with a frantic animalistic grunt and stumbled out into the freezing night air. I watched him through the spiderweb cracks of my shattered window. He was pacing erratically on the pavement, his expensive leather shoes crunching loudly on the broken glass. He was pulling at his hair, babbling incoherently to the empty street. I could barely hear him over the ringing in my ears, but I caught the panicked fragments, the press, the banks, the permits, my reputation. He looked wildly down the desolate avenue, his body instinctively angling away from the steaming wreckage of my car. He was calculating his escape route. He was preparing to leave the scene before the flashing lights of the police cruisers appeared. He was going to leave me trapped in the crushed metal. My right arm felt entirely numb, but I forced my trembling left hand down into the dark footwell, desperately sweeping the floor mats to find my phone. My vision was swimming, dark spots dancing at the edges of my sight. I needed to call 911. I needed an ambulance. My fingers finally brushed against the smooth glass screen of my phone. I pulled it up, my thumb hovering over the emergency dial button. Just as the screen lit up my bruised face, twin beams of blinding white headlights swept aggressively across the ruined front end of my vehicle. A sleek, heavy black sedan came tearing around the corner and screeched to a sudden violent halt just inches from our rear bumper. The heavy doors flew open simultaneously. It was my parents. For one brief, pathetic fraction of a second, a surge of pure childlike relief washed over me. Mom and Dad were here. It was going to be okay. But then my father, Martin Wallace, stepped into the harsh, unforgiving glare of the street lamp overhead. His sharp eyes did not dart toward the smoking wreckage. He did not search the crumpled metal for his daughter. Instead, his gaze locked instantly onto Dean. He rapidly assessed the blood on his son's face, the massive damage to the property, and the deafening silence of the empty street. My mother, Celeste, rounded the back of their sedan. Her face was not etched with maternal panic or fear. It was a mask of terrifying, icy calculation. She looked like a general surveying a battlefield where things had gone terribly wrong. They did not step toward my crushed passenger door. They did not look through the shattered window to see my bleeding face or hear my ragged, painful breathing. In that single frozen moment, standing there in the cold glow of the headlights, the ringing in my ears finally faded away. It was replaced by a heavy, absolute, and utterly chilling certainty. They had not sped through the night to save me. They had come to save Dean. My father's expensive leather shoes crunched rhythmically against the pavement, stopping exactly 3 feet from my door. I waited for his face to appear in the empty frame of my blown-out window. I waited for the frantic, terrifying question every parent screams when they see their child in a crushed vehicle. It never came. Instead, Martin Wallace walked past my side of the car entirely. He marched straight to where my brother stood, trembling on the curb. My mother, Celeste, followed close behind her husband. She did not even glance in my direction. Her eyes were darting meticulously up and down the brick facade of the buildings, scanning the dark alleyways, searching for the small, blinking red lights of security cameras. She was sweeping the perimeter. They were not parents pulling up to a horrific accident. They were corporate fixers arriving at a public relations disaster. I shoved my good shoulder against my jammed door, kicking the latch with my heel until the bent metal groaned and popped open. I practically fell onto the damp asphalt, clutching my bruised ribs, my breath shallow and ragged. I looked up, expecting them to finally acknowledge my existence. My father was gripping my brother by both shoulders, giving him a hard, calculated shake. His voice was low, devoid of any warmth, sounding more like a chief executive officer delivering an ultimatum in a boardroom. He reminded Dean that the city zoning board hearing for the Wallace Crescent project was scheduled for 9:00 sharp on Monday morning. He listed the stakes with a terrifying mechanical precision. $80 million in syndicated loans, 3 massive commercial partners, the absolute necessity of the state liquor licenses. My father's grip tightened on Dean's ruined suit jacket. He stated clearly that a driving under the influence charge, instantly compounded by a fleeing the scene felony, would cause the entire syndicate to pull their funding before noon tomorrow. The empire would collapse because Dean could not handle his bourbon. My father released him and pointed a sharp finger toward the idling black sedan they had just arrived in. The order was absolute. He told Dean to take the sedan and drive straight to our family lake house on the edge of the county. He commanded him to leave his smartphone on the passenger seat of the wrecked crossover so his digital location data would effectively die right here at the pharmacy. He instructed him to strip off his clothes the second he arrived, shower in scalding water, and burn the suit in the fireplace for a fraction of a second. Dean hesitated. His eyes flickered toward me, a brief cowardly flash of guilt cutting through his intoxicated panic. But the fear of our father was infinitely stronger than any lingering affection he held for his sister. Dean knew perfectly well that Martin Wallace always found a way to scrub a battlefield clean. My brother swallowed hard, nodded weakly, and jogged toward the sedan. The engine revved, and he disappeared into the night, taking the only truth of this disaster with him. I staggered forward, the cold night air biting fiercely into the fresh cuts on my face. I yelled at them, my voice cracking, demanding to know what they were doing. I pointed to the crushed front end of my car, explicitly stating that I was sitting in the passenger seat. I screamed that Dean was the one behind the wheel, that Dean was the one driving at 80 m an hour, and that for once in his pampered, shielded life, he needed to stand there and face the consequences of his own reckless destruction. My mother turned to me, the street lamp cast deep, hollow shadows across her cheekbones. She did not look at me with sympathy. She looked at me the way one might look at a miscalculated spreadsheet. She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the asphalt, and cut my protest down with a single ruthless strike of logic. She told me that Dean carried the entire future of this family on his back. She said his face was the brand, His reputation was the collateral, and his success was the only thing keeping our generational wealth intact. Then she looked me dead in the eye and delivered the verdict. She said I was merely a contract coordinator. A misdemeanor on my record was a bump in the road. It was, in her exact words, a minor career hiccup from which a diligent worker could eventually recover. My father moved to stand beside her, presenting a united, impenetrable front. He did not ask for my cooperation. He dictated my new reality. He ordered me to step around to the driver's side of the wreckage and sit on the curb. He fed me the script line by line. I was driving. I hit a slick patch of black ice or loose gravel. When the police cruisers arrived, I was to act hysterical. I was to hyperventilate. I was to absolutely refuse the roadside field sobriety test and unequivocally deny the breathalyzer, blaming my refusal on severe shock and panic. He promised me with a terrifyingly calm assurance that Dr. Hale, our high-priced family attorney, would be waiting for me at the precinct to handle the rest. I stared at the two of them, my blood turning to ice. My ribs screamed in agony with every breath, but the physical pain was completely eclipsed by the profound, sickening betrayal unfolding in front of me. I shook my head fiercely. I refused. I told them I would not lie for him. I told them the police would see my injuries match the passenger side impact. I told them I would tell the officers exactly who was driving the moment they arrived. That was when they unleashed the fatal blow. They knew exactly where to strike. My father stepped closer, invading my personal space, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He reminded me that the closing date for the downtown loft I had spent 2 agonizing years saving for was this coming Thursday. He casually mentioned that the bank still required his signature as the final financial guarantor to release the mortgage funds. He stated flatly that if I'd opened my mouth to the police, his pen would never touch that contract. The sale would fall through, and I would lose my 20% escrow deposit entirely before I could even process the threat to my home. My mother stepped in to finish the execution. She smoothly added that the short-term bridge loan they had graciously extended to me last month to cover the earnest money would be called in immediately. I did not have the liquid cash to pay it back within 24 hours. And then she tilted her head, finding a look of deep maternal sorrow. She wondered aloud what the senior partners at Marrow and Pike Infrastructure would think when she personally called my division head on Monday morning. She said she would simply have to express her grave, heartbroken concern about my recent erratic behavior, my sudden lack of focus, and the hidden spiraling drinking problem she had just discovered. They were going to destroy my reputation before I even had a chance to defend it. They would bankrupt me, render me homeless, and poison my career, all before the sun came up. I was standing in a trap perfectly designed by the two people who were supposed to protect me. In the distance, the shrill, rising wail of police sirens pierced the quiet night. The sound echoed off the brick walls of the empty warehouses, growing louder and more urgent by the second. Red and blue lights began to bounce off the distant building facades, painting the street in rapid, frantic bursts of color. I looked at the shattered remains of the vehicle I had proudly bought myself. I looked at the dark stains of my brother's blood on the deployed airbag. I looked at my parents standing there with their arms crossed, impeccably dressed, completely untouched by the violence of the crash, waiting for my submission. They had calculated my exact breaking point. They knew the crushing weight of their leverage. I was cornered between the total annihilation of my personal future and the immediate terrifying destruction they promised to rain down upon me. The flashing lights rounded the corner, blinding me. The sirens screamed in my ears, defeated, suffocating under the weight of my own family. I slowly lowered my head. I nodded. The heavy steel door of the precinct holding cells slammed shut with a final echoing boom that rattled my already bruised ribs. The process of being entered into the criminal justice system was not a dramatic television sequence. It was a slow, deliberate grinding away of human dignity. I was aggressively fingerprinted, my hands stained with a thick, greasy black ink that simply refused to wash off under the freezing trickle of the bathroom sink. I was ordered to stand against a cinder block wall and photographed under harsh flickering fluorescent lights that brutally highlighted every fresh cut on my cheek, and the dark, exhausted purple hollows under my eyes. The arresting officer, a weary man with deep lines framing his mouth, who looked like he had seen 10,000 liars before me, read the preliminary charges from his battered clipboard: driving under the influence of alcohol, failure to submit to chemical testing, malicious injury to private property, reckless driving. The paperwork formed an iron cage around me, and every single printed document forged another unbreakable bar. The vehicle registration was printed clearly with my name. I was the sole individual found standing anywhere near the scene. And most damning of all, I had recited the exact clumsy fabrication my father had drilled into my head just minutes before the police cruisers had arrived. When they finally pulled me into a small windowless interrogation room, my own body betrayed me. The agonizing throbbing in my right shoulder and the sharp, stabbing pain in my chest made me sweat entirely through my ruined silk blouse. I stuttered uncontrollably when the detective asked about my timeline for the evening. I constantly avoided his direct gaze because looking at him made me feel like I was suffocating. I contradicted myself twice regarding the exact speed I was supposedly traveling down Elm Avenue. To the seasoned detectives in that room, my physical shock, my trembling hands, and my desperate, disjointed lying did not look like the behavior of a coerced victim. It looked exactly like the classic fumbling guilt of a heavily intoxicated driver desperately trying to save her own skin. They stopped asking questions after roughly 30 minutes. They did not need to press me any further. They already possessed their neat, easily packaged narrative. It was nearly 6:00 in the morning when the stern desk sergeant finally called my name across the crowded booking area. My parents had wired the $10,000 bond. I limped slowly out into the pale, freezing light of dawn, clutching my wallet and keys inside a clear plastic evidence bag. My father's luxury sedan was idling smoothly at the curb when I slid cautiously into the premium leather of the back seat. The atmosphere inside the cabin was thick, heavy, and completely suffocating. There were no tears of relief from my mother. There was no gentle hand reaching back from my father to ask how much physical pain I was enduring. The drive back to our estate felt exactly like the silent, tense car rides we took after my father ruthlessly gutted a competing real estate developer during a hostile board meeting. This was not a rescue mission. It was a post-operation debriefing. My mother tapped her perfectly manicured nails against her glowing tablet screen, quietly informing my father that the local morning news broadcasts had not yet picked up the police scanner chatter. The Wallace Crescent project remained blissfully untarnished by scandal. They spoke over me, around me, and through me as if I were nothing more than a piece of damaged logistical equipment they had been forced to retrieve from a storage facility. We arrived at the sprawling, immaculate Wallace estate just as the bright morning sun broke over the impeccably manicured privacy hedges. I walked through the grand mahogany front doors, my entire body aching violently for a hot shower, a heavy dose of painkillers, and the safety of my bed. I froze instantly in the grand foyer. Dean was sitting casually at the massive marble kitchen island. He was freshly showered, smelling of expensive cedarwood cologne, wearing a plush cashmere sweater and crisp linen trousers. His hair was slightly damp and perfectly styled. He was casually scrolling through the financial news on his smartphone, a halaten plate of scrambled eggs and smoked salmon resting on the counter in front of him. The tiny, carefully concealed flesh-hold bandage near his hairline was the only physical evidence proving he had nearly killed us both just hours prior. He looked up as I dragged my battered body into the bright light of the kitchen. For a long, suffocating moment our eyes locked. I desperately searched his handsome face for a single ounce of genuine remorse. A sliver of the older brother who used to defend me when we were small children. There was absolutely nothing. His lips slowly curled upward, moving just a fraction of an inch into a distinct chilling smirk. He raised his ceramic mug and took a slow, deliberate sip of his black coffee. In that single, breathtakingly arrogant gesture, the entire truth crystallized in my mind. He had not just obeyed our father's orders out of blind panic at the crash site. He had fully and consciously embraced the trade. He fully accepted that I would sink so he could keep himself afloat. I withdrew to my old childhood bedroom, dropping heavily onto the mattress without even having the strength to take off my worn-out shoes. But sleep was an absolute impossibility. Through the thin drywall connecting my room to the upstairs study, I could clearly hear my mother's voice. It was pitched perfectly in that sickeningly sweet, artificially tragic tone she exclusively reserved for charity galas and country club gossip. She was on the phone with my aunt. I lay there paralyzed, listening as my mother meticulously and ruthlessly planted the seeds of my social destruction. She whispered dramatically about how much immense pressure I had been under at Marrow and Pike Infrastructure. She sighed heavily, fabricating a detailed story about how I had been isolating myself from the family for the past 6 months. Then came the lethal poison. She confided with fake, breathless sorrow that the family had been suspecting a deeply hidden, escalating drinking problem for quite some time, and last night was simply the tragic, inevitable breaking point. They were not just controlling the immediate legal fallout. They were aggressively rewriting my entire personal history. Any future defense I might try to mount, any truth I might try to shout to my relatives was being preemptively poisoned. I was being permanently branded as an unstable, overwhelmed alcoholic before I even had a court date assigned to my name. By 10:00 in the morning, the heavy wooden doors of my bedroom swung open without a warning knock. Victor Hale, the family's elite, exorbitantly expensive defense attorney, stepped confidently into the room. Victor was a man seemingly carved from polished granite and tailored Italian wool. He possessed a terrifyingly calm demeanor, built firmly on 3 decades of making wealthy people's ugliest sins completely disappear. He pulled up a velvet chair directly across from my bed, smoothly unlatched his briefcases, and pulled out a thick stack of pristine white legal documents. He did not ask me how the accident happened. He did not ask if I was actually innocent. He simply looked at me coldly over the thin gold rim of his reading glasses and methodically outlined my immediate future. Victor explained in a flat monotone voice that we were going to pursue a strict strategy of absolute damage control. He stated unequivocally that we would not fight the driving under the influence charge in front of a jury. Instead, I would quietly plead no contest to a slightly reduced misdemeanor. I would gratefully accept a 12-month suspended sentence. I would be legally ordered to complete 250 hours of community service and pay full financial restitution for the completely destroyed pharmacy storefront out of my own pocket. Most importantly, he slid a glossy, heavy stock brochure across my comforter. It advertised a highly exclusive, strictly confidential outpatient rehabilitation clinic nestled deep in the nearby mountains. He told me I would enroll voluntarily by the end of the current week to show the judge I was taking responsibility for my supposed actions. I stared down at the colorful brochure, my chest tightening until I could barely draw breath. I looked back up and told Victor, my voice shaking with fury, that I was not driving the vehicle. I told him I did not have a single drop of alcohol in my bloodstream. Victor smiled. It was a thin, bloodless, horrifyingly patient expression. He leaned forward and gently tapped the official police report with his solid gold pen. He reminded me softly that the legal narrative was already set in stone. The circumstantial physical evidence, my own recorded admission of guilt to the arresting officers at the scene, and my family's heavily funded, unified front, made any alternate version of the truth completely irrelevant to the court. He instructed me to keep my head down, accept the minor bruises to my ego, and stay entirely silent until the news media cycle moved on to a brand new scandal. I looked at Victor Hale. I looked at the meticulous way he organized his legal papers, so brutally efficient, so emotionally detached. Then a freezing dark wave of absolute clarity crashed over me. Victor was not my lawyer. He was not sitting in my bedroom to defend my civil rights or to uncover the actual truth of the crash. Victor Hale was strictly retained by the Wallace Family Trust. He was the ultimate protector of the Wallace corporate brand. In this intricate high-stakes financial equation, I was not his client. For the very first time in my 28 years of existence, the grand illusion of my loving family completely shattered into dust. In their calculating eyes, I was never truly a cherished daughter. I was never a beloved younger sister. I was simply a liability waiting to happen. And today, I had been officially reclassified by my own blood as a necessary operating loss, a disposable write-off to be quietly absorbed by the corporate ledger in order to protect their most valuable golden asset. The dismantling of my life did not happen all at once. It was not a sudden, violent explosion, but a slow, methodical demolition. It began on a bleak Tuesday morning at the corporate headquarters of Marrow and Pike Infrastructure. I was summoned to the Human Resources Department on the 14th floor. The director, a woman with whom I had shared coffee and pleasantries for 3 solid years, sat behind her frosted glass desk with her hands folded tightly together. She did not offer me a seat. She informed me, in a tone dripping with calculated corporate neutrality, that my pending promotion to senior contract manager was being officially placed on an indefinite hold. The background check system had automatically flagged my weekend arrest. She used sterilized words like core values, public optics, and pending legal resolution. Even though I had not been convicted of a single crime, the mere shadow of a driving under the influence charge was enough to render me totally radioactive. I walked out of that office feeling like a ghost haunting my own career. The second pillar to crumble was my absolute last lifeline to independence. By Wednesday afternoon, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from my mortgage broker. For 2 entire years, I had skipped vacations, packed my own lunches, and lived on a razor-thin budget to save the 20% down payment for a beautiful downtown loft. The broker sounded genuinely pained. He explained that the bank's underwriting department had run a final standard check before the scheduled Thursday closing. The pending criminal charges, specifically the malicious destruction of commercial property, violated the moral turpitude clause of the lending agreement. The bank was immediately suspending the release of the funds. The seller was already threatening to walk away and keep my earnest money deposit. The sanctuary I had bled for was gone, erased by a single keystroke in a banking terminal. I was completely drowning, and my own family was actively holding my head underwater. Because my vehicle was destroyed and my current apartment lease was expiring in exactly 2 weeks, I was effectively trapped in my childhood bedroom at the estate. It was there, creeping through the silent, heavily carpeted hallways, that I bore witness to the true mastery of my mother's psychological warfare. I stood frozen outside the parlor doors, listening to Celeste Wallace orchestrate my social execution. She was on a lengthy phone call with my godmother, her voice trembling with a perfectly rehearsed maternal heartbreak. She spun a devastating, entirely fabricated narrative. She whispered that the family had been finding empty wine bottles hidden deep in my closet for the past 8 months. She claimed my severe work stress had driven me to secret, uncontrollable binge drinking. She was methodically salting the earth by planting these venomous lies with the biggest gossip in our extended social circle. My mother ensured that if I ever tried to scream the truth about that night, everyone would simply shake their heads in pity. They would see me not as a victim of my brother's crime, but as a tragic, deeply in denial alcoholic lashing out at her loving, supportive family. My defense was completely poisoned before I even hired a real lawyer. But the most nauseating blow arrived on Thursday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen island, staring blankly at my laptop screen, when an alert popped up for a popular local business. The guest of the hour was Dean. I clicked the play button, my hands trembling violently. His smooth, charismatic voice filled the room. The host practically fawned over him, asking about his leadership style in the upcoming development project. Without missing a single beat, my brother launched into a passionate, practiced monologue about the absolute necessity of strict personal discipline. He spoke about taking extreme ownership of mistakes. He preached about accountability and the heavy burden of leadership. He sounded so incredibly earnest, so profoundly noble. He was a man who had cowardly fled the scene of a violent crash, leaving his sister bleeding in the wreckage. And yet, here he was being broadcast to thousands of listeners as the undisputed moral compass of Belhaven. I slammed the laptop shut, sprinting to the bathroom just in time to empty my stomach into the porcelain bowl. That same evening, the true depth of their cruelty was finally laid bare. I was walking back from the kitchen when I heard my parents speaking in hushed, urgent tones inside my father's oak-paneled study. I pressed my back tightly against the cold wall in the corridor, holding my breath. My father was reviewing the legal timeline. He casually mentioned that once I formally entered my guilty plea, and the media attention completely evaporated. They needed a permanent solution to keep me out of sight. My mother swiftly agreed. She suggested a highly restrictive, incredibly remote psychiatric wellness retreat in the desert of Arizona. She said it would take at least 6 months to properly stabilize my mental state. My blood ran completely cold. They were not talking about medical treatment. They were talking about exile. They were planning to lock me away in a gilded cage, completely isolating me from the outside world until the development broke ground and my brother's legacy was permanently secured. I was to be silenced, heavily medicated, and hidden away like a shameful family secret. I retreated to my room, my entire body shaking with a profound, terrifying rage. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the large brown manila envelope toward me. It contained the personal effects the police and the hospital had returned to me upon my release. I dumped the contents onto the mattress. Among the crushed tube of lipstick and my cracked phone screen was a folded piece of yellow carbon paper. It was the initial triage report from the emergency room. I smoothed the crumpled paper out on my lap, my eyes scanning the hastily scribbled medical shorthand. The attending physician had documented my injuries with clinical precision. A severe deep tissue contusion covering the entire right shoulder, deep bruising along the right side of the rib cage, a hairline fracture on the right pelvic bone. I stared at the words until my vision blurred. The steering wheel was on the left side of the vehicle. If I had been driving, the brutal impact of the deploying airbag and the seat belt lock would have battered my left shoulder and my chest symmetrically. But all of my severe trauma was concentrated heavily and exclusively on my right side, the exact side that slammed violently against the passenger door and the center console when the heavy car fishtailed and smashed into the steel bollards. The physical evidence of my innocence was literally bruised into my own flesh. I immediately dialed Victor Hale's private office line. When he finally answered, sounding deeply annoyed by the interruption, I practically shouted the medical findings into the receiver. I demanded he take the medical report straight to the district attorney. I told him it proved beyond a shadow of a doubt the exact physical position I held during the impact. Victor let out a long, patronizing sigh. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that made my skin crawl. He spoke to me as if explaining a basic math concept to a very slow child. He stated that in a court of law, medical bruising was highly subjective. He claimed it could easily be explained away by the chaotic, tumbling physics of a high-speed collision. He said a skilled prosecutor would simply argue that my body bounced off the center console after the initial strike. Then his voice dropped an octave, turning sharp and deadly. He reminded me that a working-class jury would always choose to believe the impeccable, well-documented narrative of a prominent, highly respected philanthropic family over the desperate, rambling theories of a disgraced woman with a newly discovered drinking problem. He told me to throw the hospital paperwork in the trash and to stop wasting his billable hours. He hung up the phone without another word. I sat in the deafening silence of my bedroom, holding the dead phone in my hand. The dial tone hummed in my ear, a flat, endless note of absolute finality. I slowly placed the receiver down on the nightstand. I looked at the yellow medical report and at the locked door of my bedroom. For the past 4 days I had been trapped in a state of deep, desperate grief. I had spent hours sobbing into my pillow, wrestling with the painful thought that my own flesh and blood could let me go so easily. I had silently begged the universe to make them feel just a fraction of the guilt they deserved. But sitting there in the dark, the tears completely stopped. The crushing, suffocating weight of my sadness hardened into something else entirely. It crystallized into a sharp, freezing, brilliant clarity. There was no point in begging for mercy from people who viewed me as collateral damage. There was no point in waiting for a rescue that was never going to come. My parents and my brother had built a perfectly engineered, airtight fortress of lies to bury me alive. They had bought the lawyers. They had manipulated the evidence, and they had poisoned the jury pool of public opinion. They believed they were absolutely untouchable. But I was the contract coordinator. My entire career was built on finding the single microscopic flaw in a seemingly perfect document. I knew better than anyone that no system was truly flawless. No cover-up was ever 100% perfect. People who operate with that level of extreme arrogance always leave a trace. They always overlook a minor detail because they believe they are the smartest people in the room. I leaned back against a headboard, staring up at the dark ceiling. I was no longer the reliable, disposable daughter. I was a woman with absolutely nothing left to lose. And as the clock ticked past midnight, I stopped wondering how to survive their betrayal. Instead, I asked myself one simple, incredibly dangerous question. What exactly did they forget? The plastic evidence bag the towing company had handed me upon my release was shoved unceremoniously under my bed. I pulled it out, my fingers tracing the jagged tear in the thick, transparent palma. Inside was a chaotic jumble of items salvaged from the crushed glove compartment of my ruined vehicle. There was a crushed box of mints, my leather registration holder, the thick owner's manual, and a stack of crisp dealership paperwork folded neatly inside a glossy cardboard folder. I spread the documents across my mattress. I was not looking for anything specific. I was merely searching for an anchor, a physical piece of reality to cling to while my family actively tried to erase my sanity. I flipped through the standard warranty agreements and the tire rotation schedules. Then a sleek dark blue trifold brochure caught my eye. It had been tucked securely behind the financing contract. The bold silver lettering across the top read, "It was the premium emergency telematics service the dealership had aggressively upsold me on the day I signed the financing papers." I had barely paid attention to the finance manager's pitch at the time, nodding along just to get the keys. Now, sitting in the suffocating silence of my bedroom, I opened the brochure and forced myself to read the microscopic fine print at the bottom of the second page. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, tracking across the tiny black letters until they locked onto a single, life-altering paragraph. It stated clearly that in the event of a severe collision involving airbag deployment, the onboard Guardian Link system would automatically initiate an emergency SOS call. Furthermore, to assist first responders and insurance investigators, the system immediately captured and stored a highly detailed telemetry packet on their secure corporate servers. This packet included exact global positioning coordinates, the precise activation status of all seatbelt tensioners, the weight distribution on the passenger seats, and a continuous, unedited audio recording of the cabin environment spanning from the moment of impact until the emergency line was formally disconnected. The contract guaranteed this data would be retained on their encrypted mainframes for exactly 90 days. My heart slammed violently against my bruised ribs. The air in the room suddenly felt thin. I closed my eyes, forcing my mind to wade back into the terrifying, chaotic nightmare of the crash. I stripped away the deafening sound of the crunching steel. I tuned out the violent hiss of the deflating airbags and the sickening crunch of Dean kicking his jammed door open. I focused all my mental energy on the seconds immediately following the sudden stop. There it was. It was faint, buried under the ringing in my ears and my brother's frantic swearing, but it was absolutely there. A crisp, sterile, synthesized female voice had echoed from the small speaker embedded in the rear-view mirror. It had asked in a calm, repeating loop if the occupants of the vehicle required immediate medical assistance. I had not imagined it. The car had been listening. It had heard every single word Dean shouted as he panicked about the zoning board meeting. It had recorded the exact moment he fled. And if the line had remained open when my parents arrived, it had captured every single venomous threat my father had weaponized against me. I could not risk using the estate's secure wireless network. My father's private security firm monitored all incoming and outgoing internet traffic on the property routers. I waited until the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 1 in the afternoon. My mother had already left for her weekly charity luncheon, and my father was locked in a conference room downtown. I slipped out the heavy oak side door, bypassing the main gates entirely, and walked 2 agonizing miles down the shoulder of the highway to the Bellhaven Public Library. The library smelled of decaying paper, floor wax, and quiet desperation. I kept my head down, pulling my hood low over my face, and slid into a plastic chair in front of public computer terminal number 7. The keyboard was sticky and the monitor possessed a severe yellow tint, but it offered the one thing I desperately needed: total anonymity. I navigated to the main Guardian Link corporate website and clicked on the portal for existing insurance claims. The screen demanded a vehicle identification number and an official incident report code. I pulled the crumpled towing receipt from my pocket, carefully typing the 17-character alphanumeric sequence into the search bar. I pressed the Enter key. The small loading icon spun for what felt like an eternity. The screen flashed white, then populated with a sterile gray dashboard. My name was listed at the top. Below it, highlighted in a bright warning red, was a file labeled Crash Event Package. I moved the cursor over the download button, my hand shaking so severely I could barely control the plastic mouse. I clicked it. A severe, authoritative pop-up window instantly blocked my path. The system informed me that the requested telematics file was currently locked by the Internal Legal Compliance Department. The data package was flagged as evidence in an active criminal investigation and could only be released directly to a verified law enforcement agency or released upon the receipt of a formal judicial subpoena. I could not touch it, but as I stared at that restrictive warning message, a cold, triumphant smile slowly spread across my face. The file existed. My parents possessed enough money to bribe politicians, silence witnesses, and purchase the most ruthless defense attorney in the state. But they could not hack into a multi-billion-dollar insurance conglomerate's encrypted mainframe and simply hit delete. The truth was sitting safely on a server in another time zone, entirely out of their reach. I logged out, cleared the browser history, and walked the 2 miles back to the estate. My mind was racing, calculating variables, mapping out an entirely new strategy. I was no longer a victim waiting for the executioner. I was a player on the board. The moment I stepped onto the grand circular driveway of my family's home, my cell phone began to vibrate aggressively in my coat pocket. The caller identification displayed Victor Hale's private office line. I accepted the call, pressing the speaker tightly against my ear. Victor did not bother with a greeting. His voice was unusually tight, stripped of its normal patronizing smoothness. He bluntly instructed me to stop making unauthorized inquiries regarding my vehicle. He warned me, his tone dropping into a dangerous, growly register, that attempting to play childish tech games with the insurance providers would only complicate his delicately negotiated plea deal. I stopped dead in my tracks. Victor Hale was a man who never revealed his hand unless he was forced to by actively warning me to stay away from the telematics data. He had just made a massive, fatal, unforced error. He had inadvertently confirmed that my parents' side already knew the Guardian Link recording existed. They had undoubtedly tried to quietly suppress it or purchase it, and they had hit the exact same legal firewall I just had. They were terrified. The final devastating piece of the puzzle arrived an hour later. The afternoon courier dropped a thick, certified legal envelope on the front porch addressed directly to me. I tore it open in the foyer. It was a formal civil summon. Eleanor Voss, the fiercely independent owner of the pharmacy my brother had demolished, was officially suing me for immense property damages, lost commercial inventory, and severe emotional distress. I rapidly flipped through the dense pages of the civil complaint. On page 4, buried deep within the plaintiff's preliminary arguments, Eleanor's aggressive civil attorneys had listed their intended avenues of discovery. My eyes locked onto paragraph C. They were formally requesting a court order to compel the release of an emergency transmission recorded by the vehicle's onboard telematics system. Eleanor Voss had not taken the Wallace family payoff. She was out for blood, and her lawyers knew exactly where the murder weapon was buried. I stood alone in the grand echoing foyer of the house that had become my prison. The crushing, suffocating weight of despair that had paralyzed me for days completely vanished. It was replaced by a sharp, freezing, and utterly terrifying adrenaline. The infallible Wallace family machine had made a catastrophic error. They had focused all their immense power on silencing the human elements of the crash, completely forgetting that the machine itself possessed a perfect, incorruptible memory. The evidence was not gone. The indisputable proof of my brother's crime and my parents' horrific betrayal was sitting behind a corporate firewall, waiting to be summoned. The only problem remaining was entirely tactical. I had to find a way to drag that digital package out into the blinding light of a courtroom before my family could find a corrupt judge to bury it forever. And to do that, I realized with absolute certainty I could no longer rely on their rules. I needed to burn the script they had written for me to the ground. The municipal courthouse possessed a distinct, suffocating smell of stale coffee, industrial floor wax, and nervous sweat. It was the morning of my preliminary hearing. The polished wooden benches of the gallery were packed with minor offenders, exhausted public defenders, and restless police officers. I sat at the heavy defense table, staring blankly at the deeply scarred oak surface. Victor Hale stood impeccably tall beside me. His custom-tailored charcoal suit was a glaring, arrogant anomaly in the shabby municipal room. Directly behind the low wooden barricade separating the gallery from the well of the court, my parents sat in absolute terrifying stillness. They projected the perfect image of a somber, supportive, wealthy family standing by their deeply troubled daughter. The script was finalized. The choreography was set. I was to stand up, quietly mumble my plea of no contest, accept my heavily brokered probation, and officially become a convicted criminal. The presiding judge, a gray-haired man who looked entirely bored with the morning docket, called my name. He adjusted his reading glasses and asked if defense counsel was ready to enter the agreed-upon plea on the record. Victor unbuttoned his suit jacket, flashing his gold cuff links. He opened his mouth, preparing to deliver the final nail into my coffin. I pushed my chair back. The heavy wooden leg scraped violently against the linoleum floor, echoing loudly through the silent chamber. I stood up, my spine completely straight, despite the agonizing flare of pain radiating from my bruised ribs. I looked directly at the judge and spoke in a clear, ringing voice that I barely recognized as my own. I stated for the official court record that I was immediately and permanently terminating Victor Hale as my legal representation. The silence that crashed down over the courtroom was absolute and deafening. I did not turn my head, but I could vividly feel the sudden freezing vacuum of air right behind me as my parents completely stopped breathing. In that moment, I shattered their meticulously crafted illusion in public. Victor visibly flinched. The slick, arrogant veneer completely evaporated from his face. He leaned in, desperately, whispering through gritted teeth that I was having a panic attack and ruining everything. I ignored him completely. I addressed the judge again, stating clearly that my current counsel possessed a massive undeclared conflict of interest and was actively working against my civil liberties. The judge slammed his wooden gavel down, severely annoyed by the theatrical disruption, but he had no choice. He formally dismissed Victor from the defense table and ordered the bailiff to assign me a public defender from the morning pool. Because my parents had entirely cut off my financial support and frozen my bank accounts, I legally qualified for state assistance. Her name was Naomi Trent. We were directed into a cramped, windowless consultation room just down the hall. Naomi walked in carrying a massive, heavily taped cardboard file box. She looked chronically exhausted. She wore a dark blazer that had seen better decades. Her hair was pulled back in a messy clip, and she possessed the sharp, weary eyes of a woman who fought losing battles for a living. Most importantly, she did not give a single damn about the prestigious Wallace family name. She dropped the heavy box onto the wobbly metal table, slumped into a plastic chair, and rubbed her temples. She bluntly warned me that if I was going to waste her limited time with a spoiled rich girl sob story, she would walk right back out the door. I did not shed a single tear. I reached into my coat pocket and slid 2 items across the scratched metal table. The first was the yellow hospital triage report detailing the massive blunt force trauma concentrated exclusively on the right side of my body. The second was the glossy blue Guardian Link telematics brochure. I laid the facts out with the cold mechanical precision of an engineering contract coordinator. I explained the physics of the crash and the exact location of my injuries. I explained the hidden data server containing the vehicle's telemetry. Then I detailed exactly how Martin Wallace and Celeste Wallace had systematically threatened my home, my career, and my freedom to shield their golden heir from a felony charge. Naomi stopped rubbing her temples. She picked up the medical report, her eyes scanning the physician's hastily scribbled notes. She picked up the brochure, reading the fine print regarding the emergency audio recording. The chronic exhaustion completely vanished from her posture. It was instantly replaced by the terrifying laser-focused intensity of a seasoned litigator who had just spotted a massive bleeding vulnerability in a completely corrupt system. She realized immediately that she was no longer looking at a standard pathetic drunk driving misdemeanor. She was looking at a massive multi-tiered felony conspiracy involving witness coercion, subordination of perjury, and insurance fraud. Naomi pulled a blank urgent motion form from her chaotic briefcase and began writing furiously. She told me she was filing an immediate sealed ex parte subpoena directly to the Guardian Link legal department. She was not just asking for the audio. She was demanding the raw data. She explicitly requested the historical logs for the driver's seat weight calibration, the steering column tilt settings, the exact millisecond timestamps of the seat belt retractor lock-up events, and the complete, unedited digital audio file of the emergency distress call. But a legal battle required more than just digital ghosts. 2 days later, under the cover of a torrential evening downpour, I drove a borrowed, battered sedan to a dimly lit, greasy diner on the absolute furthest edge of the county line. I sat in a secluded corner booth, nervously sipping lukewarm black tea until the front bell chimed. Elena Voss slid into the vinyl booth across from me. She was a tough, gay-haired woman who had spent 30 years building her independent pharmacy from the ground up, only to watch my brother turn it into a pile of shattered glass and twisted metal. I had expected her to scream at me. Instead, she looked at me with a profound, calculating sharpness. She leaned forward, lowering her voice below the hum of the diner's ventilation fan. She revealed that less than 48 hours after the collision, 2 intimidating men in expensive suits representing my father had paid a quiet visit to her temporary office. They had offered her a certified cashier's check, covering the complete inflated cost of the structural damages plus an additional $100,000 in pure, untraceable hush money. The only condition attached to the massive payout was her immediate signature on a strict non-disclosure agreement permanently omitting the name Dean Wallace from any current or future civil and criminal complaints. Elena had flatly refused the bribe. She despised being bullied by wealthy, arrogant developers who thought they owned the city. She opened her leather handbag and slid a thick manila folder across the sticky diner table. She said her refusal was not just based on principle. It was based on the hardware she had installed last year. The folder contained the internal alarm system logs from her pharmacy on the night of the impact. The perimeter glass break sensors had obviously triggered the exact second the heavy crossover smashed through the storefront. But the crucial damning detail was buried in the exterior motion tracking camera logs. While the physical camera lens itself had been completely destroyed by the flying debris, the system's time-stamped motion alerts had survived on the cloud backup. The data definitively proved that a human figure had scrambled violently away from the driver's side of the wreckage exactly 45 seconds before a second. Heavily limping figure finally emerged from the passenger side door. It was the undeniable digital footprint of my brother's cowardly retreat. I took the thick stack of alarm logs straight back to the public defender's office. Naomi analyzed the timestamps, a feral, triumphant grin spreading across her face, but she immediately reined it in, cautioning me against premature victory. She warned me that my family was incredibly dangerous, especially when cornered. If the Guardian Link audio turned out to be garbled by the crash, or if the recording cut off too soon, a high-priced defense team could still spin a confusing narrative about the occupants shifting seats in a blind panic. Naomi stated firmly that we could not rely on a single magic bullet. We had to build a microscopic, inescapable cage. We had to construct a braided rope of cross-referenced evidence so tightly woven that it would choke off every possible escape route my father tried to buy. The timeline of the pharmacy alarm logs had to lock perfectly with the telematics weight sensor data, which then had to align flawlessly with the asymmetrical bruising documented in my medical reports. I walked out of the municipal building that afternoon and looked up at the towering, intimidating glass facade of the courthouse. I felt a strange, thrilling electricity buzzing beneath my skin. I was no longer the obedient, trembling girl nodding along to my own destruction in the cold street lights. My father truly believed the legal system was simply another luxury commodity he could purchase to crush his enemies and protect his assets. For the first time, I understood how to turn that immense machinery right back at him. The counterattack did not come as a loud, violent explosion. It arrived as a suffocating invisible gas slipping quietly under the door frame. It started on a Tuesday afternoon when my burner phone buzzed against the cheap laminate counter. It was Naomi. Her voice was uncharacteristically tight, vibrating with a frantic, entirely suppressed panic. She informed me that the district attorney's office had suddenly filed an emergency motion to expedite my formal plea hearing. They had successfully lobbied the scheduling judge to move the date up by 3 entire weeks. The new court date was set for this coming Friday. It was a blatant, heavy-handed maneuver orchestrated directly by my father. Martin Wallace was utilizing his extensive, deeply entrenched judicial connections to slam the legal window completely shut before the subpoenaed telemetry data could physically cross state lines. He was trying to force a swift conviction while my hands were completely empty. The cat-and-mouse game had officially begun, and I was the prey caught in a rapidly shrinking trap. I had fled the sprawling family estate immediately after firing our corrupt attorney in open court, retreating to my old, cramped rental apartment for the final few days of my expiring lease. I was sitting on the floor, surrounded by half-packed cardboard boxes, when a soft, hesitant knock echoed through the thin wooden door. I looked through the peephole, and my blood instantly turned to ice. It was Celeste. She wore a simple cashmere cardigan and possessed a deeply sorrowful, exhausted expression that I had not seen since I was a terribly sick child. Against every single survival instinct screaming in my head, I unbolted the door. She stepped inside, her eyes rapidly scanning the chaotic stacks of moving boxes, analyzing my living conditions. She reached out, attempting to gently grasp my trembling hand and manufacture a perfectly executed, tearful sigh. She whispered that the family was simply terrified for my well-being. She claimed they only wanted to end this horrible nightmare, begging me to stop fighting the system so they could get me the professional psychiatric help I so desperately needed. But the warmth in her eyes was entirely dead. It was a hollow, predatory performance. She was not standing in my living room to offer a maternal truce. She was a scout sent directly into enemy territory to probe my defenses. She casually asked about my new public defender, subtly fishing for any hint of what specific legal strategy I might be planning, trying to determine exactly how much I truly knew about the vehicle's memory. I kept my face entirely blank. I pulled my hand away and offered her nothing but a freezing dead silence until she finally surrendered the theatrical act. She walked out without another word, her jaw completely tight with hidden fury. The psychological warfare escalated the very next morning. My cell phone chimed with a direct text message from Dean. It started with a pathetic, half-hearted apology about how entirely out of hand things had gotten, but the final sentence aggressively stripped away the cowardly facade. He wrote explicitly and clearly, "Do not make things worse for all of us." It was not a plea from a troubled older brother. It was a carefully worded threat from a cornered animal realizing his cage was rattling. Less than 2 hours after that message arrived, the final devastating blow to my independence landed. My escrow agent called, his tone laced with a deep, highly uncomfortable pity. The Wallace family trust had officially and permanently frozen the final tier of my short-term financial support. Because of the sudden withdrawal of the guaranteed funds, the commercial bank had immediately canceled the final underwriting process. The purchase agreement for my downtown loft was officially dead. I had lost the down payment, the property, and the 2 grueling years of intense sacrifice it took to build it. Before I could even properly process the total loss of my future home, my professional life was summarily executed. At exactly 3:00 in the afternoon, the Vice President of Human Resources at Marrow and Pike Infrastructure requested an immediate mandatory video conference. She did not look me in the eye through the camera lens. She coldly stated that the corporate office had received an extensive, highly concerning anonymous information packet. The dossier allegedly contained deeply disturbing, highly detailed allegations regarding my supposedly erratic behavior, professional negligence, and severe substance abuse. Even though the claims were entirely unverified, the sheer volume of the anonymous complaints blatantly violated their strict corporate ethics policy. I was immediately placed on an indefinite, unpaid administrative leave pending a comprehensive internal investigation. I was completely severed from my salary, my health insurance, and my professional dignity. In a matter of 5 I drove to the public defender office in a state of absolute shock. I found Naomi sitting behind a mountain of printed legal discovery files, looking utterly sick to her stomach. She turned her computer monitor toward me, pointing a trembling finger at a digital document properties tab. It was a digital copy of the anonymous smear packet sent to my employer. Naomi explained that the opposing counsel had carelessly included the digital file in a massive unorganized data dump during the mandatory discovery exchange. She had run a basic metadata extraction protocol on the file out of pure curiosity. The original digital author tag did not point to a concerned coworker or an anonymous corporate whistleblower. It pointed directly to the registered corporate network of Victor Hale's private law firm. The high-priced attorney had not merely advised my parents on how to cover up a felony crime. He had actively and enthusiastically participated in the malicious fabrication of evidence to systematically destroy my life. The conspiracy was so much darker and so much more heavily funded than we had ever imagined. I returned to my dark, empty apartment and collapsed heavily onto the bare mattress. I was entirely out of moods. The walls were closing in with terrifying, unstoppable speed. I had zero income, zero place to live by the end of the month, and a totally ruined professional reputation. The expedited court date was looming just 3 days away, and the massive corporate entity guarding the telematics data had remained completely, agonizingly silent. My family had successfully starved me out, utilizing their immense wealth and influence to isolate me, crush my spirit, and heavily barricade every single avenue of escape. I stared up at the cracked plaster ceiling, my vision blurring with hot, exhausted tears. They had won. The machine was simply too massive, too welcomed, and too entirely ruthless for one single person to dismantle. I reached blindly for my phone, fully preparing to call Naomi and tell her I was ready to surrender to the plea deal. Then the phone vibrated violently against the floorboards. I ignored it, but it rang a second time, then a third, screaming urgently into the quiet room. I finally reached down and accepted the call. Naomi did not say hello. She was breathing incredibly heavily, as if she had just sprinted up 5 entire flights of stairs. She commanded me to listen very closely. A certified legal courier had just walked through the heavy double doors of the municipal courthouse. The compliance oversight officer from the Guardian Link corporate headquarters had formally responded to our subpoena. They had filed a sworn notarized affidavit directly onto the official court docket. Naomi's voice cracked with a wild mixture of pure exhaustion and profound aggressive triumph. The affidavit explicitly confirmed that a complete, uncorrupted headphone audio file of the emergency event had been successfully retrieved from their secure encrypted servers. The file had not been intercepted by my father's fixers. It had not been altered by high-priced lawyers. And most importantly, the digital storage drive containing the recording had bypassed the compromised district attorney entirely. It had been delivered straight into the physical hands of the presiding judge's head clerk. The final door had not slammed shut. The lock had just been blown completely off its hinges. The heavy oak door of the judge's private chambers remained sealed, shut for exactly 45 minutes. I sat on the hard wooden bench in the desolate second-floor hallway of the municipal courthouse, my hands folded tightly in my lap. The air in the corridor felt unusually thin, practically humming with the static electricity of an impending storm, when the heavy wooden door finally clicked open. Naomi emerged. She did not say a single word at first. She simply walked over to the bench and sat heavily beside me. Her face was incredibly pale, but her dark eyes held a terrifying, lethal sharpness. She slowly exhaled a long, trembling breath, and the expression on her face was all I needed to see. She turned her head slightly, leaned in, and whispered that the Wallace family was entirely, irrevocably. The digital file retrieved from the Guardian Link servers was not just a brief, chaotic snapshot of the impact. It was an absolute massacre. Naomi explained that the system's emergency microphone was remarkably sensitive and had activated the exact millisecond the airbags deployed. It flawlessly captured the horrifying, deafening crunch of the steel ballards tearing through the engine block. It recorded my brother's unmistakable, heavily slurred voice immediately following the crash, cursing violently about how the disaster was going to ruin the massive zoning board meeting on Monday. It perfectly documented my mother's chillingly calm surgical instructions, urging Dean to flee into the shadows and abandon the vehicle before the police cruisers arrived. But the most devastating piece of evidence was the sheer duration of the recording. The emergency telematics line had remained wide open, recording crystal clear audio for over 12 agonizing minutes. It captured the exact moment my father leaned his head into the crushed cabin. It recorded his voice, sharp and ruthless, explicitly ordering me to take the blame to protect the commercial development project. And worst of all, it captured him utilizing textbook financial extortion, threatening to permanently destroy the escrow deposit on my downtown loft and financially ruin me if I dared to tell the arresting officers the truth. It was a flawless, unedited masterpiece in witness tampering, coercion, and criminal conspiracy. I felt a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline spike through my veins. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to march directly to the Wallace estate, kick the front doors open, and scream at them. Naomi instantly reached out, her fingers digging painfully into my forearm, anchoring me to the wooden bench. She strictly forbade me from showing any emotion. She laid out the strategy with cold military precision. There were to be no angry confrontations in the courthouse lobby. I was not allowed to send a single cryptic text message to my brother. I was to issue absolutely no warnings of any kind. We had to let them walk into the courtroom on Friday completely blind, entirely wrapped in their own arrogant certainty. They had to believe their ruthless manipulation was still working flawlessly. The trap would only spring shut if they willingly stepped into the center of it. My parents operated exactly as Naomi had predicted. In the 2 grueling days leading up to the expedited plea hearing, they moved through Bellhaven with the serene, untouchable confidence of royalty. Through the grapevine of my former co-workers and distant relatives, I heard detailed whispers about their meticulous preparations. They were selecting their wardrobe for the courtroom with the exact same clinical precision they used to plan a high society charity gala. My mother had reportedly purchased a new conservatively cut navy blue suit, perfectly tailored to project the polished image of a grieving but resilient matriarch. My father was practicing his solemn, heartbroken expressions in his private study. They were fully prepared to sit right behind me in the gallery, flawlessly playing the roles of the tragic, loving parents standing stoically by their deeply flawed alcoholic daughter. My brother, remaining completely true to his cowardly nature, did not even plan to attend the hearing. I learned through a mutual acquaintance that Dean had booked a first-class flight to Florida, scheduled to depart at exactly 8:00 on the morning of my trial. His official excuse was an urgent inspection of a potential commercial investment site in Miami. In reality, he was putting 1,000 miles between himself and the scene of his crime. He was completely confident that the powerful adults in the room would successfully sweep his mess under the rug while he drank complimentary champagne at 30,000 T. He genuinely believed he had gotten away with it. The local rumor mill was functioning exactly as my family had designed it. The wealthy elite of Bellhaven whispered confidently over their expensive lunches at the country club. The universally accepted narrative was that my legal troubles were a tragic, strictly private family matter that was being handled with quiet, expensive dignity. Everyone firmly believed I was going to stand before the judge, quietly plead guilty to a minor misdemeanor, and gracefully disappear into a luxury rehabilitation center in the mountains. The massive Wallace Crescent development project remained completely unblemished in the public eye. The corporate investors were happy, the city council members were satisfied, and the Wallace brand was stronger than ever. When Friday morning finally arrived, I woke up in my dark, empty rental apartment. The brown moving boxes were still stacked against the cracked plaster walls, holding the meager, packed remains of my shattered life. I walked into the bathroom and stared at my reflection under the harsh fluorescent light. The ugly purple and yellow bruises on my right shoulder were finally beginning to fade into a dull, sickly gray. I dressed slowly, choosing a simple, inexpensive black blazer and plain tailored trousers. I did not bother to apply any concealer to cover the healing cut on my cheekbone. I wanted the judge, the prosecutor, and every single person in that gallery to see exactly what physical damage my family had inflicted upon me. As I walked out of my apartment building and stepped into the crisp morning air, a very strange, entirely unfamiliar sensation washed over me. For my entire 28 years of existence, I had lived completely trapped under the suffocating, heavy shadow of the Wallace family empire. I had constantly feared their disapproval. I had desperately craved their validation. I had allowed them to dictate my career path, aggressively monitor my finances, and ultimately systematically sacrifice my freedom for their own gain. But as I started the engine of my cheap rental car and pulled out into the morning traffic, the crushing weight of that lifelong fear was completely gone. My father had successfully stripped away my promising career at the engineering firm. My mother had successfully poisoned my reputation among our entire social circle. They had collaborated to incinerate my life savings and completely obliterate my dream of owning a home. They had taken absolutely everything they could possibly take from me. They had left me with nothing, but in doing so, they had inadvertently handed me the most dangerous weapon of all, because I had lost nearly everything there was to lose. I was now completely immune to their leverage. I had no inheritance left to protect, no corporate job left to save, and no loving family left to mourn. I drove toward the municipal courthouse in absolute silence. The sky above Belle Haven was a heavy, bruised purple, signaling the arrival of a massive, violent storm sweeping in from the coastline. The barometric pressure dropped rapidly, making the atmosphere feel incredibly thick and electric. I parked the car in the visitor lot and stared up at the imposing concrete pillars of the courthouse. I was walking directly into the epicenter of the storm. My parents were already waiting inside, completely convinced that today was the day they would finally bury my voice and secure their golden legacy forever. They believed I was just a quiet, obedient contract coordinator who would lower her head and accept her unjust punishment. They had absolutely no idea that the terrified girl they broke on the freezing pavement that night no longer existed. I unbuckled my seat belt, opened the heavy door, and stepped onto the pavement. I was no longer afraid of them. For the very first time in my life, I realized with absolute freezing clarity that they were the ones who needed to be terrified. I pushed my shoulder against the heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4, and the immediate wall of sound and body heat hit me like a physical blow. I had anticipated a sparse, thoroughly depressed morning crowd comprised solely of minor traffic violators and overworked public defenders. Instead, the polished wooden gallery benches were packed shoulder to shoulder. Belle Haven was a city that fundamentally thrived on the spectacular failures of its elite, and the Wallace family name was the absolute crown jewel of local gossip. I recognized at least 3 prominent commercial real estate investors sitting in the back row. 2 reporters from the local Financial Chronicle were casually leaning against the back wall, their notepads resting expectantly on their knees. A smattering of my mother's wealthy social acquaintances were strategically scattered throughout the room, their eyes hungry for a tragedy. They had all gathered to watch the highly anticipated ritual sacrifice. They were here to see the deeply troubled, notoriously problematic Wallace daughter bow her head, publicly absorb the disgrace, and politely accept her criminal brand so the multi-million-dollar empire could continue undisturbed. I walked down the central aisle, keeping my spine perfectly rigid, my eyes locked securely on the defense table. Naomi was already seated, her battered leather briefcase open, carefully arranging a very thin, very specific stack of documents. As I pulled out my chair, I felt a distinct prickling heat radiating against the back of my neck. I did not need to turn around to know exactly who was sitting in the very first row directly behind the wooden partition. My parents had positioned themselves to be the absolute center of the gallery's sympathetic attention. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught the sickening perfection of their performance. My mother, Celeste, was dabbing at the dry corners of her eyes with a pristine white linen handkerchief. She wore a tailored, conservative charcoal dress that projected the exact image of a devastated, loving matriarch who had spent the last 5 nights awake weeping for her lost child. Beside her, my father, Martin, sat with his broad shoulders slightly hunched, his jaw clenched in a masterful display of stoic, paternal agony. To the uneducated observer, they looked like two heartbroken parents bravely enduring a public nightmare. I was the only person in the room who knew their exhaustion did not stem from grief, but from the relentless, demanding labor of coordinating a massive felony cover-up lingering casually near the low wooden gate that separated the gallery from the well of the court was Victor Hale. Although I had aggressively fired him days prior, he had still shown up, leaning against the polished wood with a terrifying absolute arrogance. He was acting as the unofficial overseer for the Wallace Trust. He offered me a brief, sickeningly patronizing nod as I sat down. He was entirely convinced that his backroom machinations and heavily funded pressure tactics had successfully held the line. He fully believed the expedited hearing was a mere formality, a quick, clean, surgical strike that would permanently end the crisis before lunch. At the opposing table, the assistant district attorney was frantically shuffling through a towering stack of manila folders. He was a younger, heavily caffeinated man who clearly viewed this case as a simple open-hand shot driving under the influence charge. He possessed the relaxed, slightly bored posture of a prosecutor who knew he had the full, quiet backing of a very powerful family desperate to sweep a scandal away. He had not prepared for a fight. He had absolutely no idea that he was standing on top of a massive, unexploded bomb. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open, and the bailiff instructed the courtroom to rise. The presiding judge, a severe man with sharp features and zero tolerance for theatrical nonsense, took his seat and immediately called the docket. He looked down over his reading glasses, his gaze settling heavily on our table. He stated my name for the official court record, listed the extensive preliminary charges, and then asked the single question the entire room had been holding its breath for. He asked how the defendant wished to plead. My father shifted his weight in the wooden pew directly behind me, completely ready for the final victory. Victor Hale crossed his arms, a smug smile threatening to break across his face. Before I could even part my lips, Naomi Trent stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor, a sharp, abrasive sound that violently cut through the thick tension of the room. She did not look at the prosecutor, and she certainly did not look at my parents. She locked eyes directly with the judge. She stated in a voice that was dangerously calm and terrifyingly clear that the defense wholly refused to enter a plea at this time. She announced that we were filing an immediate emergency motion to introduce severely exculpatory evidence. But she did not stop there. Naomi raised her chin and formally declared that the defense was officially alleging massive coordinated obstruction of justice, systemic witness coercion, and a multi-tiered criminal conspiracy directly involving the individuals seated in the gallery. A collective, entirely audible gasp ripped through the packed courtroom. The reporters in the back row instantly snapped to attention, their pens flying aggressively across their notepads. The bored socialites sat up perfectly straight. The atmosphere in the room shifted violently from polite curiosity to profound electric unease. The judge frowned deeply, his gavel hovering dangerously over the sounding block. He demanded to know exactly what kind of ridiculous courtroom ambush the public defender was attempting to pull in his chamber. Naomi did not flinch. She simply turned her head toward the judge's head clerk, a quiet woman sitting at the administrative desk just below the bench. Naomi stated that a certified encrypted digital storage drive had been formally delivered by a bonded legal courier directly to the clerk's office exactly 20 minutes before the session began. The judge glanced sharply down at his clerk. The clerk nodded, her face completely pale. She stood up, holding a small sealed plastic evidence bag containing a silver flash drive. She walked quickly across the well of the court and handed the bag directly to the assistant district attorney. Leaning in to whisper a few frantic, hushed words into his ear, I watched the prosecutor very closely. As the clerk's words registered in his brain, the bored casual posture completely evaporated from his body. He ripped the plastic bag open, his hands suddenly shaking, and plugged the silver drive into his secure court terminal. He clicked the mouse, opened the verified Guardian link affidavit attached to the audio file, and began to read the certified transcript summary. The transformation was absolute and terrifying. The color drained entirely from the prosecutor's face, only to be rapidly replaced by a dark, furious red flush. His eyes widened, scanning the digital text with a frantic, disbelieving intensity. He looked up from the glowing monitor, and his gaze bypassed me entirely. He looked directly past the wooden barricade. He looked straight at my father. The prosecutor's eyes had fundamentally changed. They were no longer the exhausted eyes of a man processing a minor traffic violation. They were the cold, hyper-focused eyes of a predator who had just been handed the biggest, most corrupt political kill of his entire career. I felt the sudden, frantic vibration of movement right behind my shoulder. Martin Wallace was not a man who panicked easily. He had spent 3 decades ruthlessly crushing his corporate rivals without ever breaking a sweat. But as he met the prosecutor's lethal predatory stare, the floorless mask of the grieving father completely shattered. I heard him draw a sharp, jagged breath. I heard the expensive leather of his shoe scraped violently against the floorboards as his entire body went rigid with pure, unadulterated terror. He finally realized that whatever was on that drive, his money could no longer suppress it. The judge, entirely losing his patience with the silent exchange, banged his gavel hard. He demanded that the state explain the nature of the submitted evidence immediately. The prosecutor stood up, his voice trembling slightly with a massive surge of adrenaline. He looked at the judge and stated that the state formally requested an immediate suspension of all plea proceedings. He declared that the evidence submitted by the defense appeared to completely exonerate the defendant standing before the court while simultaneously implicating multiple unindicted individuals in severe felony crimes. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of frantic whispering. Victor Hale pushed himself off the railing, his face a mask of absolute horrified realization, desperately trying to catch my father's eye. My mother let out a small choking sound, the linen handkerchief completely forgotten in her trembling hands. The judge slammed his gavel down 3 consecutive times, roaring for absolute order. The heavy booming sound echoed off the high ceiling, instantly crushing the rising panic into a suffocating stone-like silence. The air in the room grew so dense it felt difficult to pull into my lungs. The judge glared at the prosecutor, his expression darkening with righteous fury. He ordered the district attorney to patch the digital audio file directly into the courtroom's central public address system. He commanded that the file be played in its entirety right here in completely open court so he could hear exactly what kind of rot had infected his jurisdiction. The prosecutor's finger hovered over the keyboard. The entire gallery completely stopped breathing. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the scarred oak table, listening to the agonizing silence right before the final execution. Then he clicked play. There was no grainy security footage to squint at, no blurry video that a highly paid defense expert could claim was doctored, confusing, or misinterpreted out of context. What flooded the massive courtroom speakers was pure, high-fidelity digital audio. It was raw, metallic, and intimately terrifying in its clarity. First came the deafening concussive explosion of my vehicle colliding with the solid steel ballards, followed instantly by the violent hiss of the deploying airbags. The terrible sound echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings of the courthouse, making several people in the crowded gallery physically flinch in their seats. Then, rising above the mechanical death rattle of the ruined engine came my brother's voice. Dean was not speaking with the polished, charismatic cadence he utilized on local business podcasts. He was sobbing, his words heavily slurred and dripping with cowardly panic. He practically hyperventilated as he confessed loudly and clearly to the empty street that the massive Monday morning zoning board hearing would be completely destroyed if the city council found out he was driving drunk. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, but the audio file was far from over. The heavy slam of a car door echoed through the speakers, signaling the arrival of my parents. The courtroom listened in horrified silence as my mother's voice cut through the chaos. Celeste Wallace did not sound like a panicked mother finding her children bleeding in a mangled wreck. Her tone was sharp, surgical, and terrifyingly cold. She explicitly ordered Dean to run, She commanded him to take their luxury sedan, flee to the lake house, and strip off his ruined clothes before the police sirens grew any closer. Right behind me, I heard a sharp, strangled gasp. I did not turn around, but I knew my mother had just realized her pristine, untouchable social reputation was bleeding out onto the courtroom floor. Then came my father. Martin Wallace's voice boomed through the speakers, heavy with absolute authority and cruel calculation. The entire gallery listened as he completely ignored my weeping and my obvious physical pain. Instead, he cornered me. Every single threat he had hissed into the freezing night air was rebroadcast for the judge, the press, and the local elite to hear. He explicitly promised to permanently cancel the financial guarantee on my downtown loft. He threatened to seize my 20% escrow deposit. He swore to cut off every single avenue of my financial support if I did not sit in the driver's seat and lie to the police to protect his commercial development project. The silence in the courtroom was so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. But the absolute climax of the recording, the final inescapable nail in the coffin, was not spoken by my family. It was the automated Guardian Link emergency operator cutting directly through my father's vicious extortion. A sterile synthesized voice repeated its programmed protocol. It stated clearly over and over, asking if the individual located in the passenger seat required immediate medical evacuation. The machine had permanently pinned my exact physical location inside the vehicle precisely while my family was actively plotting to stage a fake crime scene. Before the audio file even finished playing, Naomi was on her feet. She did not give the opposition a single second to breathe or formulate an excuse. She practically slammed a thick binder of printed telemetry logs onto the prosecutor's table. She loudly declared that the digital sensors inside the vehicle perfectly corroborated the audio recording. She cited the exact data points. The driver's seat weight sensor had registered 215 pounds at the exact moment of impact, which was Dean's precise body weight. The steering column was adjusted for a man over 6 feet tall, and crucially, the passenger seat belt tensioner was the only one that had locked across a frame matching my exact physical dimensions. The assistant district attorney stood entirely frozen for 3 long seconds. He looked at the mountain of irrefutable evidence, then looked directly at my father, who was now gripping the wooden barricade so hard his knuckles were entirely white. The prosecutor completely abandoned his original case right there on the spot. He turned his back on my family and faced the judge. His voice shook with a mixture of professional embarrassment and absolute outrage. He formally requested that all charges against Reese Wallace be dismissed with extreme prejudice immediately. Furthermore, he asked the court to issue immediate no-bail arrest warrants for Dean Wallace, Martin Wallace, and Celeste Wallace. He listed the new devastating felony charges one by one: obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit perjury, witness coercion, severe insurance fraud. Victor Hale tried to aggressively push himself away from the gallery railing, desperately attempting to distance himself from the toxic fallout, but the judge was not finished. The judge pointed a furious, trembling finger directly at the high-priced attorney. He noted that in the final seconds of the audio recording, my father had explicitly stated that Victor Hale would coach me on exactly how to lie to the arresting officers. The judge ordered the bailiffs to detain Victor in a separate holding room immediately, pending a full investigation by the State Bar Association for severe conflict of interest and acting as an accessory to a felony cover-up. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down, finalizing the total destruction of the Wallace empire. The fallout was not gradual. It was immediate and utterly catastrophic. By 3:00 that very same afternoon, the local news stations were running the scandalous story on a continuous, brutal loop. The city council held an emergency session and permanently froze all zoning permits for the Wallace Crescent development. The massive syndicate of commercial banks pulled their $80 million in funding before the stock market even closed for the day. My phone, which had been completely silent for a week, suddenly rang. It was the Vice President of Human Resources at Marrow and Pite Infrastructure. She was stumbling over her words, profusely apologizing for rushing to judgment based on anonymous lies. She formally rescinded my unpaid suspension, immediately reinstated my position as a contract coordinator, and promised full back pay. But the most profound moment of my life happened just minutes after the judge adjourned the morning session. I stood in the center aisle of the courtroom watching two armed bailiffs place heavy steel handcuffs on my parents' wrists. They had been entirely stripped of their power, their arrogance, and their impenetrable armor of wealth. As they were being led toward the side holding cells, my mother suddenly stopped. She turned her head and looked directly at me. For the very first time in my entire existence, Celeste Wallace did not look at me like a disappointing investment or a convenient liability. Her eyes were wide, frantic, and filled with a profound, shattering terror. It was the authentic, desperate look of a mother who finally realized she had completely and permanently lost her daughter. She opened her mouth, perhaps to beg for forgiveness, perhaps to finally offer the maternal love I had starved for my whole life. But I did not run to her. I did not shed a single tear for the destruction of my family. I did not ask for an apology, and I certainly did not offer one. I simply held her gaze for one long, silent second, allowing her to fully absorb the absolute finality of my indifference. Then I turned my back on them. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the courtroom and walked out into the bright, blinding sunlight of the courthouse steps. The storm that had been threatening Belle Haven all morning had finally broken, leaving the sky a brilliant, washed clean blue. I inhaled a deep, steadying breath of the crisp air. I had walked into that building as a sacrificial lamb, completely stripped of my home, my career, and my dignity. I walked out as a woman who had burned a corrupt empire to the ground using the exact same truth they had tried so desperately to bury. No one was holding the keys to my future but me. I was finally the one in the driver's seat. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are listening from. So, please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people. Thanks.